So we're going to get a little weird and go through some weird ideas. So let's just go ahead and dive straight in. So if you don't mind, let's just zoom into very much a storyteller mode for just a minute, okay? The silence of that hospital room hung heavier than most. My scabbed knees crunched on the plastic chair that I knelt on, tracing the seams of egg-white wallpaper in that doctor's office. And I wondered to myself, even at 5 years old, how did they get the entire cystic fibrosis ward to smell like the plastic of a urine sample cup? All right, did I actually clock any of these frilly little details as a 5-year-old? Absolutely not. But we feel this funny need, this urge to retroactively embellish some of the big moments and memories in our life. And I don't know if it's just for the sake of the drama or if it's that we are actually a little bit uncomfortable with the reality of those moments. Even when we learn something that will change the course of our life, they are shockingly mundane as they happen. What I do remember, though, I do remember the sound of my mom crying, muffled through a crack in the door. And in response to what I assume was a question from her along the lines of, what does a life with cystic fibrosis look like for him? I do remember hearing the doctor say, he will be lucky to make it to 30. And as a 5-year-old, you know what those words literally are, but you clearly lack any context to understand the implications that a dramatically shortened life will mean for your family, your friends, your schooling, your ambitions, your future family or not family. All right, let's zoom out of storyteller mode, go into a regular intro a little bit. So I'm going to be talking about perspective and storytelling and how to tell an authentic story. And I really have a big goal today. Talking to a room full of content and marketing people, talking about story is kind of a difficult, topic to innovate within. But I'm going to go for broke. I'm going to set a big goal here, and I want to try and get all of you to see story and our lives that stories are about from a new perspective that you've never thought of before. So we're going to have to get abstract and go big, but just bear with me. While getting a new physical perspective would just take going outside, we could all hike to the top of a mountain, boom, new perspective. But what does it take to gain a new perspective on something as big and broad as life or of story? Well, it takes, at the very least, we need to play. And for those who are, a little bit too much disconnected from the whimsy of your childhood, to play, we have to suspend our beliefs, take all the things that are comfortable and natural, all our ideas, put it on the shelf. I promise you can get it back at the end of the session. And we're going to have to play with some new concepts. Just put some blocks together, try on a cute new outfit, and maybe by the end of this, I can help us all get to a little bit of a creative perspective on storytelling that you haven't thought of before. So let's dive right in. Thinking about life and thinking about not life. We all think about what life is, but it's interesting how people tend to shy away from thinking about death. And I think that's weird because death is one of the very few things that we know with certainty in our life. It's one of the very few things that we know is inevitable and that we will all experience. And while there are cool benefits from orienting yourself to this, a lot of people get uncomfortable and they don't think about it. But unfortunately for me, I was given a life stuck in fast forward, and so it's not really in the budget to table that conversation until later. We have to think about it now. So you're going to think about it now too. So thinking about life and thinking about not life, we tend to think about it from that perspective. But if you think about it long enough and hard enough, you start to actually perceive life from the perspective of not life. And so that's where we're going to start in our really big abstract approach here. So to do that, let's just try and pause. Let's say that this life is some sort of a simulation and that we can assume some out-of-body perspective to look at what this life is and what our experience is. If we were a room full of programmers and we were going to try and perfectly replicate in a video game or some program what life is, where would we start? We would have to boil it down to its very, very basics to know where to start in replicating that. And while I would love to workshop with all of you kind of how you guys view the very bare bones of what this life is, we're going to jump right to one example for this session. And the way that I view it is that life consists of kind of two main components. And the first is what I'm going to call the objective, which is the objective world around us. It's the rules, it's the physics, it's everything that's material, and it's our shared environment. And then the second component is the subjective experience. And if we were to create a video game, we would need some sort of a UI to display these things because they're not as easy to see. They're a little bit more immaterial. It's things like pain and memory and feelings and thoughts. And so those two components, when merged together, I think kind of are a starting place for what makes up what this life is. So we have our subjective experience that we each have, and then the objective world that it takes place in. All right, I know we're moving fast. So quick question, I want to see hands. Who here has heard, who here has said or heard someone say something to the effect of, we're just specks on a rock flying through space? Who, right? Okay. There's this weird temptation that we get sometimes to just say, hey, zoom out, take some cosmic perspective, and maybe your problems won't seem so big. And yes, that can be super helpful to recalibrate the proportion of our response to some situation. But I think zooming out too far and lingering in that can actually have some consequences, and that it disconnects us from feelings and stories that otherwise we would hold very important to us. So let's look at our first component of those two components, which is the objective. Now, the pieces of this, it's material, it's evidence, it's circumstances, it's utility. The dimensions of our objective universe, it's the X, Y, Z. Using these, we can locate where something is in space, we can identify what it is, and we can measure it. And I know all of us have, spoiler, I know all of us have heard some compelling combination of facts and figures to try and convey just how big the universe is. But I'm going to take a stab at it too. So the Earth is moving through space in relation to the sun at 67,000 miles an hour. That's about 19 miles per second. And at that speed, it takes how long to do one revolution around the sun? 1 year. But that's just in relation to the sun. The sun is also moving through our galaxy, pulling its solar system with it. And it's moving at a blistering 500,000 miles an hour, which is about 142 miles per second. And even at that crazy speed, how long does it take our sun to do one full revolution around our galaxy? Does anybody know? You're on the right track. 230 million years. That's crazy. At 500,000 miles an hour, it still takes 230 million years to do one revolution. And that's just one galaxy out of the 100 billion to 200 billion galaxies that we believe are in the objective universe, or observable universe. So I don't know about you, but when I think about these facts and figures, it triggers this existential disquiet. I'm immediately disconnected from who I am, what I'm doing, and I'm no longer seeing the little 30-year timeline that I personally have in my own little life. I just get very disconnected from it. But speaking of time, time is another dimension, but this one's relative. I think it belongs to the other component a little bit more. It's experienced differently. The universe, 13.8 billion years. The sun, 4.6 billion years. The oldest thing on Earth is the bristlecone pine tree. It's over 5,000 years old. The oldest animal can pass 500 years. That's an ocean quahog. And then we have the average lifespan of a human, 78. And we're back to little old me, lucky to make it to 30 years. Just to diffuse the tension, I'm 31, I'm doing fine. So now we've zoomed out, we looked at our big component, the objective. We're going to zoom back in, we're going to resume that storyteller mode that we started with. My story. I was the youngest of 6. My dad's a therapist, and I was raised in a religion, so between that and a diagnosis, I really grappled with existence from 2 different directions. And aside from health problems and the internalization that my family's financial woes were my fault, my childhood was actually really great. I loved school, which is where I fell in love with theater. And I was supposed to study acting on the East Coast after I graduated, but I didn't have money for tuition, and I also didn't have years in the bank to justify giving to a degree. So studying acting, I pursued here in Utah. I started doing some professional stage and film, and studying acting is really interesting. Even if you never step foot on a stage, it's a wonderful psychological experiment that makes you think about yourself and the way that you move through life. Sanford Meisner, who's kind of one of the big daddies of acting, he says that acting is living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. And trying to get good at that, I start to watch TV and movies hoping that I can, clock the bad performances that aren't really connected. But then weirdly, through that lens, it bleeds off screens, and I start to watch people and their performances as themselves, and noticing when some people aren't really truthful just as themselves. So forget the under imaginary circumstances part. This living truthfully stuff is hard. It's very difficult. So we're going to look at the subjective component now, which is all about this. The subjective component now, that second component, it's things that are immaterial. It's beliefs, feelings, it's meaning, it's aesthetic. And I don't know about you, but there is this temptation sometimes to kind of fixate on big, cool, objective things like the universe. And we see science and technology, and how cool is it that our understanding of the world that governs us is getting better and better and better. And there's even sometimes an urge to say, humans are just stupid, dumb, emotional idiots. The universe is better off without us. But I want to just quickly try and make a case for why I don't believe that, and why I think that our subjective experience, our consciousness, even in a one-to-one comparison with the cosmos, is plenty unique and powerful. So the universe, let's just say there was some solar flare and it extinguished all life on Earth instantly. And let's just say that we were alone in the cosmos when it happened. And so boom, the subjective component no longer exists. All that there is the objective universe. Well, what does that look like? Well, there's no color, because color and sound are characteristics that we produce in our perception. So without us, those don't exist. The universe actually, without us, is just nothing. It's just this infinite abyss of vibrations. And another kicker is that without the perception of time, time really doesn't exist. The universe, without perceiving beings, is like a stick figure on a piece of paper trying to exist in a three-dimensional world. In its infinite abyss of nothingness, it also exists completely disjointed from the second before it to the second after it. The past and the future don't exist. And as if all of this is not bleak enough, somehow in this infinite nothingness, I would still find a way to get marketing emails about ClickFunnels. So, yeah. So now we've looked at our two components. Let's try and layer them together as we move towards what makes a story. So the dimensions of space allow us to identify what something is and where it is. The dimension of time allows us to identify when something is. And the perception of space and time allows us to identify why something is. Cause and effect is now unlocked. Past and the future are now unlocked. And all of this together equals, boom, our story. But unfortunately, with just these layers, this story only applies to objective things. We haven't even gotten to subjective living creatures. If we were going to tell the story of some asteroid in space, well, yeah, we could use this formula as it currently is. Let's go ahead and tell a full, truthful story of that asteroid's experience. Well, the year is roughly 13.8 billion. Our asteroid, which is made up of these certain materials, whose size is XYZ, used to be bigger before it collided with another asteroid about 10,000 years ago. It's currently in a revolution around Proxima Centauri. It's moving through space at X speed, and it intermittently observes the gravity of the other two stars in its solar system. Cool. That's our full story. Like the full story, all the details that we need to know about that asteroid, boom, our story is done. But unfortunately, while the math of the objective is very simple, it's 1 + 1 = 2. As soon as we go to now introduce that subjective component and try to tell the story of a living thing, well, the math looks a little bit more like the color green squared plus pineapple over pizza equals good luck. Because these are humans. Even in a comparison with the cosmos, the data set of our experience is infinitely larger than anything that exists in the universe. So if we're trying to tell a full, truthful story, there is so much more that we need to know now. These are humans whose physical and chemical properties are far more minute. Our sense of time is more granular, our whys are more complex. And now, because these are perceptive beings who have some level of self-awareness, we don't only need to ascertain their why, but we also need to understand their perceived why, which is susceptible to about 1,000 arbitrary values, core beliefs, and systems. And then to add to that, we also need to know their thoughts and feelings. Humans, their thoughts and feelings, which change dramatically by the minute. And to try and gather the data on their thoughts and feelings, we have to either communicate with them or observe them express themselves, both of which they're exceedingly bad at. And unlike the asteroid, which isn't capable of misrepresenting its story to us, humans have a penchant for it. So we need to update our equation if we're going to try and tell a story about humans. The next layer is the internalization of what, where, when, and why now allows us to identify the experience of something. So a little bit more complicated, wouldn't you say? All right, so in trying to represent our stories well and tell the truthful stories despite all of these chaotic variables, I think distinguishing between these two components is actually really helpful. Because quite often, part of the reason that we misrepresent our experiences is because we mistake one of these components for the other. So some examples, I promise I'm not just trying to have some pothead conversation. Let's make it relatable and make this whole exploration make a little bit of sense. So an example of mistaking one for the other. Let's say mistaking the subjective for the objective. Now, if you've been in therapy or spent 5 minutes in a psychology class, you've probably heard of cognitive distortions or thinking errors. And one of the main ones is called emotional reasoning, which we're all guilty of at times. And this is the condition of being so heavily influenced by our feelings that we use them in place of evidence to make a conclusion about objective reality or objective circumstances. And some examples of that would be, oh, I feel jealous. My girlfriend must be cheating on me. Or despite all the work and results that I have in my work, I feel imposter syndrome. Therefore, there must be some glitch in the system, and I'm robbing the system. Or how about, let's just make it even more basic. I feel anxious. Therefore, something bad must be about to happen. We legitimately would rather trust those feelings as premonitions of reality, rather than to consider the possibility that maybe our feelings are just feelings, and that they have a reasonable why that doesn't involve you being that so raven. So another example, going the other direction, mistaking the objective for the subjective. I'm guilty of this one too. Ruminating on the objective and science and technology and how cool it is. Sometimes you can see a lack of objective evidence for meaning that you land on a conclusion about the meaninglessness of life. But I think that's mistaking one for the other again, because you're looking at a lack of objective evidence to try and make a conclusion about subjective meaning. Meaning belongs on the subjective side, and so we shouldn't equate those two things. Now, it's not always as simple as just mistaking one for the other. I'm going to give a couple more examples to help dial this in. And as I give these examples, I'm going to ask after if someone pops into your head as you hear these next examples. Sometimes it's just a matter of drifting a little bit more towards one of the components rather than the other, and relying on the aspects of one and kind of neglecting the other. So an example would be somebody who kind of drifts a little bit too much into the subjective, can be indulgent and can be out of touch. They can be difficult to coexist with because they are increasingly susceptible to their own flippant temperaments. They can be harder to hold accountable because they no longer value evidence and logic as much as they do their feelings and instincts. People on this side, their self-awareness can take a ding in that they become too idealistic, losing sight of and taking for granted the way that the world around them practically works. Now on the other side, somebody who drifts a little bit more towards this objective, well, this person can be cold and uncaring. They can be a little bit too materialistic. They can miserly hoard things, seeing their materialistic values and feeling somewhat disconnected from creating sentimental values in their life. And on this side, their self-awareness can take a ding in that they become overly pragmatic and they're unimaginative and they become a little bit too quantitative rather than qualitative in the way that they approach their life. All right, as I gave those examples, I want to know, did anybody pop into your head on one side or the other? Wow, okay, no. Okay, so now the next pitfall when we're trying to tell a truthful story, whether it's ourselves or for somebody else, a big pitfall is we have expectations that can confuse the components again. If a little kid came up to you and she's crying, tears streaming down her face, and she's holding a rock, and she says a boy at recess tricked her into buying this rock with a promise that if she held it, it would always make her happy. Well, you would want to tell her that's not how happiness works. Not only will a physical thing not make you happy, there's no physical things that will guarantee a feeling. That's not how happiness works. It's immaterial. It's a subjective thing. But the good news is, you don't have to hold a thing to be happy. That's something that you can find within yourself. So, disappointment is a violated expectation, which is our next piece. I think too often we can view the relationship between things and feelings a little bit too much like one-to-one commerce. A dollar equals a happiness unit. One promotion suddenly means that I feel contentment, or finishing this one project, cleaning out the garage, and suddenly I'll feel peaceful. And that's just not how it works. It's better to think of objective things like numbers and to think of subjective value as variables. If I see Sarah in her life solve for S and she's happy, and then in my life I get up to the plate and I plug in the exact same number that Sarah used in her life but for mine, well, I'm probably in for some disappointment. So, just to reiterate on this subjective component, happiness, sentimental value, romance, meaning, these are things that we are solely responsible for. And that if you want to feel them, you have to create it. It is not transferable. You are the engine in generating your own subjective value. All right, here's an in-your-face, low-hanging fruit example. Does a diamond ring plus a snow princess dress and everybody gathered to see you on your special day equal guaranteed happiness? No? What? Okay, hold on. Let's make the diamond fatter, let's make the dress snowier, and let's make it a Jamaica destination wedding that somehow everybody was able to make it to. Now is it guaranteed happiness? Oh, see, my little happiness rock analogy isn't so far-fetched now. Okay, so another example of this. We've heard that a Rolex can be a really cool moment of success in a career. But if I'm feeling unaccomplished and unhappy, can I just run to the jewelry store, buy a Rolex, and feel good? No, because that would be buying some objective thing, chasing a subjective feeling. But let's change the example just a little bit. Let's say as a kid you heard about the Rolex being this mark in time in a career for seeing some ambition through, and you love that idea. And you really romance that idea and think about it for years. You cut out Rolex magazines or Rolex ads from magazines and put them on your wall. It's on a vision board as you work hard for years. Let's say your phone screen is saved as the exact watch that you want, and you look at it to get through sales calls. And eventually, after years, you achieve some success and you go buy that Rolex. Well, now does it equal the feeling? Maybe. You might be floored with emotion. You might have tears in your face as they fit that watch to your wrist. But in this example, was it the Rolex equals the feeling? Or was it all of that romance that I just described? It was all the years, the intentionality, and the story that resulted in that really amazing feeling. And you imbued all of that into the watch, but really at the end of the day, the watch itself was irrelevant in generating all of that value and that happiness. And so just one more quick example. If a wife comes home and her partner has made, candlelight, home-cooked dinner, handwritten note, Is the romance and all of the feelings that will ensue in that evening a direct result of filet mignon? No. It's because she sees her partner putting intentionality and focus into improving their bond. But I know that some of you might think there are examples where a thing equals a feeling, and I would just argue that if there is a situation where you think there's some direct translation, I would argue that there is a missing variable on this side of the equation. We are the variable. We are responsible for generating subjective value that we will feel or not feel. And it is not transferable. All right. One additional thought is to get esoteric again. You know, in our own personal expanding universes, it does not cascade outward irrespective of our participation in it. No, it's a direct result. If you want that universe to expand, you need to give focus and a conscious attention to it. Okay. Now, the last piece that I want to talk about as far as making stories more authentic and more full is the expression of stories, which unfortunately so many stories go unexpressed, which is really sad. They're not given the time and the attention to really metastasize. But despite how chaotic I've made the subjective component seem, and how I've placed the burden of generating those subjective values squarely onto your shoulders, there is one amazing thing that helps all of us in writing our stories. And it's that we learn from each other's stories. We are not alone. We don't need to find our story in a vacuum. Every friend, every family member, every role model, every stranger has a story that if we engage in it, it helps us understand our own better. And when those stories are told truthfully, it provides even more context to the greater whole of experience. And this goes back 2,400 years, when Greek tragedies were first gripping audiences in Greece, and the audience were feeling strong emotions as they engaged in the story on stage. Two of the most brilliant minds of the time, Plato and Aristotle, had a big disagreement on whether this was a good or a bad thing. Plato believed that the audience feeling these intense emotions vicariously by watching a play thought it was a bad thing, that people would leave the theater now feeling some duplicated, undue stress in their own lives, and they might even feel inspired to go duplicate that debauchery that they saw on stage in their own personal lives. But Aristotle strongly disagreed. He said that the emotions that people are feeling when they engage in a story on stage is a form of empathy, where they are able to connect to the character and their story and their emotions so clearly that they can themselves feel that emotion. And this is a good thing because feeling that and connecting to it helps people understand their own stories. The term catharsis, if you've heard, oh, that was a cathartic experience, that word originates in this debate 2,400 years ago. Aristotle is the one who coined the term catharsis, which is a moment of emotional clarity when we connect to something, a story, a character, a person, that we can understand and feel what they're feeling. It's a form of empathy. And by feeling those emotions strongly, it helps us understand ourselves better, and we emerge from the theater feeling changed and purged of those strong emotions. So stories help all of us. So the imperative for us to tell our stories, really, it's a responsibility that we somewhat have to help all of us to live our own stories truthfully and to help other people do the same. Now, I do want to just offer one more thought, which is that there is the caveat on stories helping all of us, that they help all of us if they're expressed. And all too often, we feel too discouraged to express our own stories for fear of judgment. But hopefully this lens that I'm trying to kind of explain, which is to value stories as helpful context for all of us, well, if we can see through that lens, maybe we'll be a little bit slower to judge each other. Instead, we'll be seeing his choices or her story or their background all as helpful context to ground me in my own story. And if there's less judgment, then maybe people won't feel as discouraged to express themselves. So I want to just get romantic for one more second about dimensions. As you can tell, I really like this. Through stories, engaged in with empathy, we really do exist in multiple instances of time all at once. You know, we are not lone asteroids flying through space, only to ever know our own story, completely absent of any other greater context. No, we coexist together. We get to engage with each other's stories and learn more about the greater whole of our experience, all within our own little lifetime. All right, I fell in love with stories on the stage, and then I started a print and design company down in Utah County. And I helped entrepreneurs and companies find and further their stories. And that's actually where I met Michael Shumway, who's the founder of Riot. And we became friends. And Riot was originally one of my clients. And now many years later, I'm a client of Riot's. And I'm super lucky to say that I'm actually partnered with Riot on a future project. And it doesn't launch fully until the end of this year, so I can only tease it. But it does take some of these big esoteric ideas, and it creates, and it's about introspection and helping people identify and process difficult emotions. But another awesome program that's rolling out is Riot has their Riot Studio program rolling out, which is a nationwide collaborative of artists, athletes, creators, artists, who can contribute content, practice storytelling, share industry-related trends and news, and to brainstorm the future of marketing. So it's a really cool program. Watch out for that. And so I just want to close with just one last thought, which is, I know this was a long, windy, slightly pretentious path to get towards seeing storytelling from a fresh perspective. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me. But I do want to say that we are unique beings in this big universe. And that comes with a limited amount of time that we have to engage with each other. But lasting is something that I'm going to leave to the stars. Let's leave it to the stars and their billions of years. They're very good at it. But as for us, powerful storytellers, perceptive beings, let's focus on the things that we are uniquely good at and that the stars will never be able to do. All right. Thanks, everybody. And one more thing. I hope some of these ideas resonated. Cool. If you see something in your life through this lens of objective, subjective, awesome. But even better, I would love it if even one person in here who needed that last little morsel of encouragement to just slow down in their life and take some time to think about their own story and what they want it to look like. That would be really awesome. And if you scan this QR code, it's so philosophical, right into a pitch. But if you scan this QR code, this is actually for a free 1-hour consultation with Riot. And they are the masters of story. They are so good at brands. And so I encourage you to meet with them. Nobody does it better. Cool. Thanks, everybody.